Thank you to this person for suggesting the idea for this video. If you have an idea of a tutorial I should make, be sure to leave a comment down below. Hello everyone, I am Johnny, and welcome to part 6 of the Paper Mario tutorial series. In this episode, we're going to be replicating the text box from the Paper Mario series. This tutorial will get pretty long, but it's only so that when we add lots of characters with dialogue, it can make the process as easy as possible. So now let's take a look at how the text box works in Paper Mario the Origami King. So as we can see, the text box actually has two layers. There's a back layer, which is green, and a front layer, which is yellow. There's also a pointer that will point to the character who is speaking, and the side that the pointer is on actually changes depending on if the character is on the left or right side. When the text starts appearing, it appears one letter or character at a time. Last but not least, there's a star in the bottom right corner to signal when the text has finished displaying the characters one by one. So now that we understand how it works in the Origami King, let's try replicating it in Unity. So the first thing we're going to want to do is go up to Window and Package Manager. And as soon as it loads, we're going to want to go to the Unity registry and go to 2D Sprite and click Install. Once it has finished installing, we can close out of that. And you can see that I've imported this text box image that I'll have a link for in the description. This is just something I threw together really quickly. And we're going to want to select it, go to Texture Type and change it to Sprite 2D and UI. We're also going to want to hit Sprite Mode and change it to Multiple, and then hit Apply. And now we can go in and click this Sprite Editor. This will bring up the Sprite Editor. And from here we want to go up to the top left and click Slice and leave these settings as is and hit Slice, and you'll see it will create these like little borders around each of the four shapes. So now if we click on them, we can see that it's created 4 individual sprites, and I like the way that it's cut them, and it should be the same for you. And once we do that and it looks good, we can hit Apply, and then we can close out of this. And now if we go into our project folder, we can see that if text box has this little arrow, and we can click it and it will access the different individual sprites. So now what we're going to want to do is go to our hierarchy, right click and create UI, and then we're going to want to click Canvas. And we can just keep this named as is. And we're going to want to change a few things. So first we're going to want to change the UI scale mode under the canvas scaler from constant pixel size to scale with screen size. And the reference resolution, this can be whatever resolution your device that you want to play the game on is. So in my case it's going to be 1920 by 1080. And we're going to want to go to Match and change it to 0.5. So right in the middle between width and height. After this, we can right click on our canvas and click UI, and we're going to create an image. And I'm going to call this Text Box Layer 1. And for the image, we're going to drag in the back sprite of the text box. It's this green box, and you can see that it's going to make this green square appear. It's obviously not the right size, so if we go under the image and click Set Native Size, it'll correct itself. And after this, we can go ahead and right click on this object and create UI, and we're going to create another image, and this one is going to be called Left Pointer, and we're going to drag in the pointer object and click Set Native Size to correct it. And let's set this relative to the layer 1. So we're going to set this, because it's the left pointer, we're going to move it over a bit to about -230 and bring it down about halfway so that it's halfway through the bottom. So that's about -100. And we're going to duplicate this and we're going to rename it to right pointer. And this, we're just going to change it from -230 to +230, and then we're done with that. Next, we're going to click on our text box layer 1, and we're going to create a UI and another image, and this one's going to be text box layer 2, and we're going to drag in the layer 2 for that. Click Set Native Size. And I think that looks good already for where it is, so I'm just going to leave it as is. And one last thing we're going to do is we're going to right click again, click UI, and then we're going to go to Text Mesh Pro, Text Mesh Pro. We're going to click that. It's going to say that we need to import the TMP Essentials. Go ahead and click that. And we can rename this now to text. We're also going to add one more image, and this is going to be the star. This is the star that appears in the bottom right of the text box when the sentence is finished and you're ready to close it. We can drag in this star object and set native size, and we can move it over to the bottom right of the box. So I think about there is good. Now we can go to our text, and if I hit F while I'm hovering my mouse over the scene view, we can go over to where it is in the scene. And you can see that it has these 4 little squares around it. This is the area where the text is going to appear. So I'm going to drag this over to the edge of the text box, bring it up a bit, and then also bring it over to this side and bring it down the rest of the way. And this is going to be the area where text can appear. So if I just start spamming letters, it'll go within the text box bounds. We can leave this as nothing for now. Actually, I'm just going to put in test for now. Next, we're going to create the animations for the text box going up and down and disappearing and reappearing for when the text box appears. But first we need to go ahead and just click on our text box layer 1 because it's the parent of everything, and we're going to scale it up a little bit. I think about 1.5, or actually 1.75. And 1.75 and 1.75, and then we can go ahead and move this up to where it would normally be on the screen, which is near the top. So it's 325-ish. And now we can go ahead and go into our project folder, and we're going to right click and we're going to click create, and we're going to go to animator controller, and we're going to call this text box, and we're going to go to our text box layer 1 and drag this onto it. And now let's go to the animation tab, and we don't have any animations set up, so we're going to set one up now. So we're going to click Create, and then we're going to go to the Animations folder, and I'm going to create a new folder in here, and I'm going to call this Text Box Animations, and we can name this animation Text Open, and then save, and then we're going to hit record, and we're going to, first of all, we're going to move it up off the screen a little bit, and we're also going to go to text box layer 1, left pointer, right pointer, text box layer 2, and text, or actually not text, but these four, and we're going to go to the color, and we're going to change the alpha value to be 0. And then we're going to go to our text and change the vertex color to have an alpha of 0 as well. And then we're going to go to frame 30, and we're basically going to undo all the things we just did. So we're going to set the vertex color of the text on, for the alpha, we're going to set it back to the max. And then on these four, for the basic image color, we're going to bring the alpha back up to the max. And we're also going to, for the text box layer 1, we're going to bring it down to the normal height, which is 325. And you can see that if I go through this, it kind of makes this animation of it fading into place. Now, it's not doing anything for the star, but you don't have to worry about that because we're going to handle that through the script, because that's going to appear and disappear independently of this opening animation. So now we can go ahead and unclick the record button and go to our animator, and we can see that it's already put in an animation for text open. We're going to just drag this over here. We can go ahead and click create state empty, and we're going to call this start. And we don't have an animation for this yet, so let's go ahead and make that real quick. So I'm going to click create new clip. I'm going to call this start.anim. And for this, all we're going to do is we're going to go to our text open animation that we just created, and we're going to copy the first frame with all these keyframes. We're going to click it and then hit Control C to copy. And then we're going to go to Start and hit record and then paste it with Control V. And that's it. And then we can click to turn off the recording. Now we need to go into our animations folder and go to these text box animations. And for text open, we need to click it and turn off loop time because we don't want this animation to loop. Now we can go into our animator, and for the start animation, it's already put the start animation in for me because it's the same name as the state we just created. We can keep the speed the same, and we want to go to entry and right click it and change the state machine default state and click on our start. So whenever the game starts, it's going to start by going to this start state. And then we're going to go to text open, click on it, click Control C and then Control V, and this is going to copy paste it. And we want to rename this new one to text closed, and we're going to still have the text open animation, but we're going to set the speed to -1. So it's going to go in reverse. And lastly, we can go to our star in the canvas and go ahead and go by the name and turn off this checkbox. That'll set it to inactive, and we'll set it to active in the script later. Next, we can go to our scripts folder, and we're gonna go ahead and create all the scripts we're gonna need for this episode. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click, create C# script, and this is going to be called events. We're going to create another one, and this one is going to be called event trigger. Next, we're going to go into our Mario State Machine folder, and we're going to add a new script, which is going to be a new Mario state, and this is going to be called Mario locked state. After that, we can go back into our scripts folder, and we're going to add a new folder, and this is going to be called events. And in this folder, we're going to create another script, and this is going to be called dialog. And the last script is a bit special. We're going to go back to our assets folder, and we're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this editor, and inside of it we're going to create a script called event trigger window. Now that we've gone ahead and created all these scripts, we can go back to the events script and open it up. Now that we're in the events script, this is going to be a very short and easy script. We're first going to get rid of start and update because we don't need them. And we're also going to get rid of mono behavior. So it's just going to be public class events and then these curly braces. And actually, we're going to add one more thing. We're going to say public abstract class. And then inside of here, we're going to say public abstract void trigger function. And then we're not even going to put curly brackets here. We're just going to do the parentheses and then a semicolon. And we're also going to say public abstract void end function. And then same thing, just parentheses and then a semicolon. Now we can save that, and we want to go back into Unity, and we can go into our events folder and open up the dialog script. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to, above the class, we're going to put square brackets, and we're going to say system.serializable, and we're going to get rid of mono behavior, but we're going to replace it with events, which is the class that we just created that was abstract. And in here, you'll notice that as soon as we change it to events, we get an error, and it says dialog does not implement inherited abstract member end function and trigger function, the two functions that we just created. So we can go ahead and say public override void trigger function and hit enter, and it's going to paste in this code on the inside of the function. By default, we can just get rid of that. And then we can do the same thing, public override void end function. And again, get rid of the stuff that it throws in the middle. Now, I'm sure there's already a ton of confusion as to what override and abstract and why we write the syntax this weird way in the event script and why we put system.serializable. So I'm going to pass it over to editor version of myself to quickly explain what we're doing here. So in the events script, we have a trigger function and an exit function. All events should have a way to trigger the event, which is trigger function, and a way to exit the event, which is exit function. However, the code for each of these different types of events, whether it be dialogue, cutscenes, whatever, may be different. And so by making the different functions have the keyword abstract in the events class, it means that it's very generic and it doesn't really know what to do by itself, But then in the actual event script, which is dialog in this case, we can actually define what those functions do by rewriting the same functions and using the keyword override. This just tells the function what we actually want it to do. As long as we replace mono behavior with the events class and redefine these two functions but with the override keyword, we can add as many different types of events as we want. And then we can later have a variable for an event which can be set to dialogue, cutscenes, or whatever, as long as it has these elements. And from there, we can just say whatever event we're in, trigger the function or exit the function. We've actually done this before with the Mario state machine. In that case, the abstract class was the Mario base state, and the abstract functions were the enter, update, and exit state functions. The Mario base state script doesn't actually have a definition for what those functions should do, but the individual states like idle, running, and jumping do define what the functions do. And the reason that we put system.serializable here is because I've gone ahead and quickly opened up the event trigger script, and if I just go ahead, we're going to need this variable anyway, so I'm just going to add it now. I'm going to say public dialog. This is the class that we just created, dialog. I'm going to call it dialog with the lowercase d. If I save this and I remove the system.serializable, you'll see that even though we set it to public, if I go ahead and add an object in the hierarchy here, and let me reset its transform, and I attach this event trigger script that I just set up, you can see that the dialog variable that I just set up isn't there, even though it's public. That's because classes that we create that we want to be able to use as variables in other scripts, we have to add the system.serializable tag to be able to view them in the inspector. So if I go back into my dialog script and re-add this system.serializable and save it and go back into Unity, we can now see this dialog variable. Now obviously we haven't set up anything in the dialog script, so there's nothing there aside from the name. But this will change as soon as we add variables inside the dialog script, and we'll be able to access them from here. Now the way that we're going to trigger events is we're going to have triggers in the level. So if I go ahead and zoom in on this object that I've added this event trigger script to, I can go ahead and add, let's just go with a box collider and set it to isTrigger. And right now it's tiny, but let me scale it up a bit, 5 by 5 by 5, and move it over here. And because it's going to be using dialogue and we're going to have it be around a character, let's actually create another object. We're going to create a cube. I don't have actual character sprites right now. I'm just going to add a cube, and we're going to call this character, and I'm going to copy the position of the trigger that we just set up and set it on the character's position, move it over, and let's give the character a material. So if I go ahead and just get my hammer material and drag it onto the character, now we can see it, and it has this trigger which I'm going to set to be the child of it, and I'll call it Dialog Trigger. And now we have a character with a trigger around him, and if we're inside this trigger and we press A, we'll start talking to him after we set up the code we're going to need to do that. Now that we've got this set up, let's open up the event trigger script and actually set it up. So when we're triggering an event, we need to know a couple of things. First of all, we want to know what type of event it is. So we're going to say public enum, and we're going to call this event type, and then curly brackets, and we're only going to have one option for now, but we can add more later. We're going to say dialog, and then above this dialog variable that I set up, I'm going to say public event type. So we've worked with enums in some of my previous tutorials, but it's kind of like a multiple choice question, and all of the things you put in here are like your options, so you can pick one out of the many options. And so we can then see what option we have selected, and by putting this public event type, and then we can see what we've selected and do different behaviors accordingly. After this enum, we're going to say public enum, and this will be trigger type. So obviously there's the case where you're inside the trigger and you press the A button, but there might be just a trigger that once you enter it, it like starts a cutscene or something. So I'm going to add two. There's going to be enter trigger, comma, and press button in trigger. And similarly, we're going to say public trigger type. And last but not least, we're going to say public enum which button. And we're going to add A button, B button, X button, Y button, and last but not least, Z button. And we're below the trigger type, we're going to say public which button. So basically, for each of these variables, we can select one of the options in each of the appropriate types. So for type, we could select dialog. For trigger type, we could select either enter trigger or press button in trigger. And for button, we can select A, B, X, Y, or Z. Next, we're going to say public Mario state machine, and we're going to call this machine. And we're going to say public events, and we're going to say this event. So right now we only have one event type, which is dialog, but in future cases where we have more types of events, we could create a new class for that event and give it this event behavior up here where mono behavior normally is, and then we can set this event variable to that class. So this variable can be various different classes. So in the case of this tutorial, it's going to be set to a dialog class. The reason this is useful is because from this event we can call the functions trigger function and end function. And after this, I made a small mistake. I need to change dialog to dialog array, so square brackets. This is going to be a list of dialogues. And the reason for this is the first item in the list will be the first character who speaks, and then every time we change characters of who's speaking, we can add a new dialogue to change the character that is speaking. But we can use one dialogue if only one character is speaking. And last, we're going to say public int dialog index. So if we have multiple dialogues in this list, we need an integer to keep track of which one we're currently on. After this, we're going to say public void set this event, and then parentheses, curly brackets, and we're going to say in the parentheses event type with a lowercase e. So we're going to have to pass in an event type, which the only one we have right now is dialog, but we could add different types of events later. So we're going to say switch event type, which is this variable we just defined, and inside curly braces we're going to say case, and then we're going to say event type.dialog, which is the only option right now, and then we're going to do colon, and then we're going to hit enter, and we're going to say this event, which is the events variable that I set up here that we can be many classes. We're going to say this event is set to dialog, which is this list of dialogues, and we're going to put the square brackets, and in this we're going to say dialog index, and then we're going to hit enter and hit break. We're going to type break and do a semicolon. So basically, whenever this function is called, we're going to pass in an event type. So we're going to pass in, for this tutorial, we're going to pass in a dialog event type, and because it's event type.dialog, we're going to set this event to one of the dialogues in our list with whatever dialog we are currently on. And above this, we're going to say, we're just going to start typing update. We can use update because we have mono behavior up here. And in here, we're going to say if this event is equal to null, and null is the code way of saying nothing. So if this event isn't set to anything, we're going to set this event, so we're going to call this function that we just created, and we're going to say type. So we're going to pass in whatever type this event trigger is for, and set it to the appropriate event type. Next, let's set up the functions to actually trigger the event. We're only going to set up one right now, but we can go ahead and say on trigger enter and press enter, and we're going to say if other, which is basically the collider that entered the trigger. So if the other is Mario, so if other.tag is equal to, in quotations, player, then we're going to say machine, which is Mario's state machine script. We're going to say machine dot, and we actually haven't set this up yet, so I need to quickly go into the Mario state machine script. In our Mario state machine script, we can say public event trigger current trigger. And we can save that and go back into our event trigger script, and we're going to say machine.current trigger, which is the variable we just added. We're going to set machine.current trigger equal to this, and this is a keyword for this current script, but whatever that may be. And in this case, it's the event trigger involved. Below this, we're going to say if trigger type is equal to trigger type dot enter trigger. So if we just need to enter the trigger to cause the event to happen, like a cutscene, then we're going to say this event dot trigger function, and we can call that trigger function script as soon as we enter, which will cause the event to happen, assuming that we enter the code to actually do it. Below this, we're going to say on trigger exit, and we're going to say a very similar thing. We can actually just copy paste this, and we're going to get rid of this inside if statement, and we're going to change it from this to null. So as soon as we enter it, the machine.currentTrigger is going to be set to this script, which is this current event trigger. And then when we leave, it's going to be set to nothing because we've left the trigger. And we can go ahead and save this and go back into Unity. Now you can see on my Dialog Trigger object for the event trigger script, we have a type which only has the dialog option. We have a trigger type which can be enter trigger or press button in trigger. And we have a button type which is A, B, X, Y, or Z. And we can go ahead and for our machine, we can go ahead and drag in our player game object. And right now, if I add dialogues, there's nothing to it because we haven't really set up the dialog script. But before we get into actually setting up the dialog script, there's something a little inconvenient. Right now, we only have one event type, which is dialog, and we only have two trigger types, which are enter trigger and press button in trigger. If we were to add another event, let's say we were to add like a cutscene event, we don't want to have a variable for dialogue displaying because it's not really relevant. And in the case of just entering the trigger, we don't need to select a button to press. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our editor folder, and we have this event trigger window script that we set up earlier. And what this is going to do once we set it up is it's going to basically replace what we see in the inspector for this script. So we can change what variables we can see, and we can make it so that if we select dialogue, we can see the dialogue, but if we select some other option, which we don't have right now, the dialogue will disappear. And similar thing for the button thing, if we're in the enter trigger type, we don't need to see this button thing. So let's go ahead and open up the event trigger window script. So now that we're in this script, the first thing we can do is at the top we can add using Unity Editor, because this is going to be messing with the editor window. And above the class we can say, in square brackets, we can say custom editor, and then in parentheses we're going to say type of, and then we're going to do another parentheses and we're going to say event trigger. Basically this line here tells it whenever we see an event trigger script in the inspector, we're going to add this custom editor to it to change it up. And we can also get rid of mono behavior and replace it with editor. And we can get rid of the start and update functions because we don't need them. Now we're going to say, we're going to add a variable. It's going to be called event trigger, and that's the only variable we're really going to need. And here's where it's a little weird. So we're going to say public override void on inspector GUI, and it's going to automatically add this sentence that says base.onInspectorGUI. If you have this line, it will automatically show the default settings for the inspector when we go to the event trigger script in the inspector, but we actually don't want that. We want to change it, so we want to get rid of this. And in here we're going to say trigger is set to, in parentheses, event trigger, and then outside of parentheses we're going to say target. So on inspector GUI is basically whenever we click on an object and it has to load the inspector. So it's going to know when we click this if there's an event trigger to call the onInspector GUI, and it's going to set the trigger equal to the event trigger attached to whatever object we click. As far as customizing an editor window, the syntax for a lot of this stuff is a lot different than normal scripts, so a lot of this is going to be very weird, but I'll do my best to explain. So first we're going to say GUI layout dot label, and this is going to add like a little text label just to kind of make things a little organized. And we're going to add in quotations, and we're going to say Mario. And below this we're going to say serialized property, and we're going to call this Mario, is set to serialized object. Serialized object is the object that we've selected and the inspector is viewing. So whatever object we've just clicked on, serialized object dot find property, it's going to find a property within the script for trigger, within the event trigger, and it's going to be, so we're going to be looking for, in the event trigger script, we're looking for this Mario state machine variable called machine. So we're going to copy this just to make sure it's spelled right, and we're going to paste it in the quotations. And then below this we're going to say editor GUI layout dot property field, and then in parentheses we're going to say Mario. And I'm just going to go ahead and save this to show you what this does. So back in Unity, if I click on the dialog trigger, you can see that the event trigger is no longer showing the normal variables. It's the stuff that we set up in the event trigger window. We have a Mario label, which is just to kind of declare that this machine variable is from Mario. So I can go ahead and drag in my player for this. It's already set to this because it searched for the player state machine, the Mario state machine on the event trigger, which I had already set. But if you haven't set it, then you should go ahead and drag this in. Now let's go back into the event trigger window and continue customizing this editor. Next, we can say GUI layout dot label. We're going to add another label, and this is going to be called event. And we're going to say trigger dot type is set to, and then we're going to say event trigger dot event type in parentheses, and then we're going to say editor GUI layout dot enum popup, and we're going to say trigger dot type. By doing this, we can set the type, which is this variable in here in the event trigger. We can set it to whatever we set in this enum popup that we just added. So if I go ahead and save this, we can see that we now have an enum popup for our event type. Again, we only have dialog right now, but if we were to add more, there would be more options. Now here comes the fun part. This is where we get to set it up so that if we are on the dialog event type, we only show the stuff about dialog, and if we are on a different type, we show the stuff related to that type. So we're going to say if trigger.type is equal to event trigger.eventType.dialog, we're going to say serialized property, and this is going to be called dialog, is going to be set to serialized object dot find property, and this is going to find the property of the dialog array. So it's called dialog in here, so I'm going to copy that and paste it in quotations. And below this, we're going to say editor GUI layout dot property field dialog. And because it's in this if statement, if the trigger type is not dialog, so if it's like a cutscene, it won't show the dialog object where we can like enter text for our dialog. If we were to add other event types like cutscenes, we would go after this and say if the trigger type is equal to cutscene, and then add the appropriate variables there. Next, we're going to say GUI layout dot label, and this is going to be how to trigger, and we're going to say trigger dot trigger type is set to, and then in parentheses, event trigger dot trigger type, and after this we're going to say editor GUI layout dot enum popup. Hopefully you can see that this is a lot of rinse and repeat. And then in here we're going to say trigger dot trigger type. Back in Unity, we can now see that I have this how to trigger thing, and I can change it to be enter trigger or press button in trigger. Now we're going to say if trigger dot trigger type is equal to event trigger dot trigger type dot press button in trigger. This is similar to the event type, but the trigger type. Then in fact, actually I can just copy this inside code, paste it here, and I'm going to change this to serialized property button is set to serialized object.find property, and this should be the button variable that we set up in here. So this will be button, and replace this with a button. And last but not least, the final thing we need to do in this script is at the bottom here we're going to say serialized object dot apply modified properties, and then parentheses, and this is just going to apply any changes that we make to make sure they're finalized. So we can go ahead and save this and go back into Unity, and now you can see that if I change this how to trigger from press button in trigger to enter trigger, the button part disappears, and if I change it back, it reappears. So this will only appear if this is set to press button in trigger. And similarly, this dialog here only shows up if it's set to dialog for the event. Of course, right now we don't have any other events, but that'll change if we add more. Now, for the sake of this character, we have this trigger around the box here, and let's make it so that if Mario enters it, it'll debug.log something to the console. So let's set the event type to dialog. We're going to set the how to trigger to enter trigger, and then last but not least, we can go into our dialog script, and in the trigger function we can say debug.log triggered dialog. And if we save this and go back into Unity, if I go ahead and start the program, it's actually giving me an error because for the event trigger there is no amount of dialogues. So if I can go ahead and stop playing and just add one, even though dialogues don't really do anything right now, there always needs to be at least one dialogue if we select dialogue. And then we can go ahead and hit play again, and we're still getting an error, and this is from this event system, which we didn't actually add. This was automatically added when we set up the canvas. So close these errors, and if we go to this event system, it has this error message, and this is basically here because back when we set up input, we used the new Unity input system, but the event system by default uses the old one, so we need to replace with the new input system. And click that, and that will fix that. And now, back to what we were doing before, you can see that as soon as Mario enters this trigger, it says in the console trigger dialog because it called the trigger function, and I can leave and trigger it again, signaled by this number increasing when I re-enter. But now let's make it so that there's actually stuff in dialog and we can start adding it to the dialog box. So first, let's add a header above our variables to just keep things organized. And this is going to say main objects. And below this, we're going to put some of the main objects we're going to need. So public game object character. This is going to be the character who is speaking. We're going to have a public camera called cam. That's the camera in the scene. And we're going to say public game object called left or right object. So we're going to need the camera and the left or right object to determine which side the pointer for the text box should be on, whether it should be on the left side or the right side. Below this, we're going to say space to put a little bit of space in between these variables and the next ones. Next, we're going to put a header, and this one's going to be text box objects. So we're going to have a public game object left pointer. We're going to have a public game object right pointer. Oops. We're going to have a public game object star, that's the star in the bottom right corner of the text box. We're going to have a public event trigger called trigger. This event trigger is going to be a reference to whatever event trigger has the is currently using this dialog. After this, we're going to say public animator, and this is going to be called text box anim, so the animator for the text box. We're going to have at the top, we're going to have to add using TM Pro. This is Text Mesh Pro. This is when we added the text for the text box, we used Text Mesh Pro. In order to actually change the text, we need to add this to the top, and then here we can say public text mesh pro UGI, and we're going to call this text box. Don't get confused by the text mesh pro UGUI. It's a confusing name. Really, it's just the text on the text box. And now we're going to add another couple of variables that aren't public. We're going to have an int sentence index. So if someone is speaking and they have multiple sentences, this will keep track of which one we're on. We're going to have a bool called displaying characters. So whenever the text is being displayed, it appears one character at a time. the one character at a time sort of thing creates the effect that the words are like coming out like they're currently speaking them. Next, we're going to have a bool, and this is going to be called finish sentence early. This is going to be used if the characters of the text are being displayed one by one and we press A, it'll interrupt it and finish the sentence early. And then we're going to have a bool called closing sentence. So once all the sentences are finished, the text box will close, and we'll set this bool to true to let some of the code know that it's currently closing, and so we shouldn't do certain things. So before we do anything else, let's quickly save this and go back into Unity and set up some of these variables. So now if I go to my dialog trigger, you can see for the dialog here, I have one element, and if I expand that, I have all these things that I just added into the dialog script now. So for the main objects, the character is the character who's speaking, so that's going to be this character object. The camera is the main cam. The left or right object, we haven't set this up, so I'm going to quickly create an empty, call this left or right object, and then we can drag that in. For the left pointer, we can drag in the left pointer. Same thing with the right pointer. Same thing with the star, it's currently set to not active. And for the trigger, we're gonna click the top of this script here and drag it in. And for the text box anim, we're going to drag in our text box layer 1 because that's where the animator for it is located. And for the text box, we're going to drag in this text object. And now let's go back into the code and make these variables actually start doing some things. So before we can actually start setting up displaying the text, we first need to, right now we have the when we enter the trigger, we can call this function, but we need to make it so that there's also the option of being inside the trigger and pressing a button. In order to do this, we're going to need to go into our scripts folder and our Mario state machine and open up the Mario idle and running states, because those are the states where he can start talking from. So now I'm in the Mario idle state. And in the apress function, I'm going to say bool talk is set to false. And then I'm going to say if ctx dot current trigger is not equal to null. So the current trigger is if we're inside of a event trigger, this will be set to something. So basically, if we're inside some sort of trigger that we can trigger an event from, then we want to say if ctx dot current trigger, so whatever trigger we're in, dot trigger type, so if we enter it or if we press A, if it's equal to event trigger dot trigger type dot press button in trigger, so if it's the press A function and the ctx dot current trigger dot button is equal to event trigger dot which button dot A button. So if it's the press button in trigger type of trigger and it's set to the A button and we've just called this function, then these will be true, and it will set talk to true, and we'll say ctx dot current trigger dot this event dot trigger function. So as soon as it determines that all these criteria are met, it's going to set talk to true, and it's going to call the trigger function method in our dialog. And then after this, we're going to say if not talk, and then we're going to take these two functions from before that let us jump, and we're going to put them inside of this. So basically, if we're inside of a trigger and it's the press A next while you're inside the trigger, and it's for the A button, then it's going to call the trigger function and it's going to set talk to true, and so this part down here will be false, and so we won't jump. We'll just kind of do nothing. Now I'm going to copy and paste this top part into the Mario running state as well. And then I'm going to say if not talk, then we're going to copy and paste these two lines and paste them in here. And we could save those, and the dialog is still just saying triggered dialog. But now if I go back into Unity, if I go to the dialog trigger, and for how to trigger I change it to press button in trigger, and the button is the A button. As soon as I hit play, you can see that just entering the trigger doesn't really do anything. But if I'm outside the trigger and I press the A button, I'll jump. But if I'm inside the trigger and I press the A button, you can see that it triggered the dialog, and each time I press A, the amount of time to trigger the dialog is increased. Now if Mario is talking to someone, we don't want him to be able to move. So earlier we created a Mario locked state script. So let's open that up. We're also going to open up the Mario example state, because then we can just copy and paste everything. So Control A, Control C, and then we can go to our Mario locked state and paste it, and then change the name to Mario locked state and Mario locked state. In this state at the bottom, we're going to say void movement, and in here we're just going to say ctx.ground velocity. So Mario's ground velocity is going to be set to vector3.0, and we're going to say ctx.jump velocity is going to be set to negative ctx.gravity times ctx.groundcheck.ground normal. So it's basically just going to stop him from moving entirely. And then in update states, we can call this movement function so that it's constantly making sure that he can't move. And in this state, we're also going to copy the whole if the inner if statement from our apress function from the idle state. We can copy this and go to our Mario lock state and paste it. We can get rid of the talk is equal to true because we don't need that here. And then we can save this. Now if we go back into Unity, now we can go to our Mario state factory and quickly add a public Mario base state called locked, and it'll be return new Mario locked state, parentheses, context, comma, this, comma, and then in quotation, locked. Now if we go to our dialog script, we can say in trigger function, first of all, if sentence index is equal to 0, so we're on the first sentence, which means we've only just started, and we are not displaying characters. The only way for this to be true is if when this trigger function is called is when we first start talking. It's like when you press A to actually start talking to the character. So if this is true, we're going to say trigger.machine. Trigger.machine is the Mario state machine. And then we're going to say .current state .switch state. And then we're going to say trigger.machine .states.locked. And I'm going to go ahead and save this and go back into Unity. You can see that when I hit play, as soon as I press A to talk to the person to trigger the talking, when I'm pressing buttons to move Mario, he no longer moves because he's locked. Now let's actually finally start actually doing some stuff with the text box. So first we're going to say textbox_anim.play, and then in quotations we're going to say text open. Make sure this is the same way you spelled the animation for the text box, and comma 0. Then we're going to say float distance is set to vector3 dot distance between cam.transform dot position, comma, and character dot transform dot position. Then we're going to say left or right object dot transform dot position is set to cam dot transform dot position plus, and then in parentheses, distance times cam.transform.forward. Then we're going to say vector3a is set to character.transform.position minus cam.transform.position. And then we're going to say vector3b is set to left or right object.transform.position minus cam.transform.position. And then we're going to say float angle is set to vector3 dot signed angle between A, comma, B, comma, and then the axis is going to be cam.transform.up. So all of that probably made no sense, and that went really quickly. So I'm going to quickly pass it over to my editor self to explain what it is that we just did for everything from the distance to this angle. So what we're doing here is we're getting the distance between the camera and the character, then we're setting the left or right object's position to the camera's position, but plus the distance, but in the camera's forward direction. Then we're getting the angle between the two, and the reason we're not using just regular vector3.angle is because that will yield the same angle whether the character is on the left or right side, but signed angle will actually give us one positive and one negative, and we can use this to determine which side of the screen the character is currently on. So now that we know that this angle will be negative if it's on the right, and it'll be positive if it's on the left, we can now use that to determine which pointer the text box should use on the left side or the right side. So we're going to say if angle is less than 0, so if it's negative, that means it's on the right side. So we're going to say right pointer dot set active, and we're going to pass in true, and we're going to say left pointer dot set active, and we're going to say false. So it's going to make the right pointer visible and make the left pointer invisible. And then we're going to say trigger dot start coroutine, and this is something we haven't set up yet. We're going to say set pointer direction, and then we're going to do parentheses, and in here we're going to say right pointer dot transform, comma, character dot transform. So let's go ahead and actually set up this coroutine. So down here I can say IEnumerator and then I'm going to say set pointer direction, same way I spelled it above. In here I'm going to say transform pointer t, the t stands for transform, and then I'm going to say transform character t. And then in here I'm going to say yield return new wait for end of frame, and then parentheses. The reason we're putting this here is because this will make it wait for the end of whatever frame it calls this on, and then it will continue. The reason we need that is because our next line is going to be while textboxanim dot get current animator state info, and then in parentheses we're going to say 0 dot is name, and then parentheses and then quotations, text open, spelled the same way as the animation, and then in brackets we're going to say pointer t dot up is set to pointer t dot position minus cam dot world to screen point character t dot position, and then we're going to say yield return null. So basically the reason we needed to wait for a frame is because we set the text box anim to play this text open animation, but it actually takes a frame before it will actually start playing this animation. So if we don't put this here, it'll still be whatever animation it was on before it got set to text open, and this will be completely skipped and useless. And then in here we're saying pointer t, which is whatever pointer we passed in. So in this case, from up here, the angle was negative, so it's the right. We passed in the right pointer. We're setting its up direction to be a vector going from the character to the pointer. So it'll kind of create the pointer actually pointing at the character. And now we can go ahead and go back up here and do the same thing, but for the left side we're going to say else, and we're going to say right pointer dot set active, and this is going to be false this time, and then we're going to say left pointer dot set active true, and we're going to say trigger dot start coroutine, and then we're going to say set pointer direction, and this time we're going to say left pointer dot transform comma character dot transform. So basically this line of code and this coroutine makes it so that the pointer actually points towards the character. Now let's go ahead and save this to see our progress in Unity. So now when I go inside the trigger and I press A, you can see that the text box appears and the pointer is pointing towards the character, which is this cube. And right now it says test because that's what the text here automatically says by default. We're not actually setting it to anything yet. So let's go ahead and continue making this text box. So one obvious thing that I completely forgot to add up until this point was we need to actually have some actual sentences that we can input of what we want to display. So we could use something like public string and then give it some value of what sentence we want, but we're going to do something a little bit better. We're going to go down to the bottom of the script and we're going to go outside of the class, so outside of this right here, and we're going to say, first of all, we're going to put in square brackets system.serializable, and then we're going to say public class sentence, and this is our own class that we're creating, and this we're going to put in square brackets and we're going to say text area. And then below this we're going to say public string text and a public float speed. So first of all, this text area field makes it so that this text string is not just a single line of text. It can be like a paragraph or something like that, and it can be formatted in all kinds of ways. And this speed is going to be used to determine the speed that the text goes by. So now we can go back up to the top, and with our variables here, we're gonna say space, first of all, give us a little space in between these other variables and our sentences that we're gonna add. And we're gonna say public sentence array. So the sentence class we just set up, we're gonna make a list of sentences, and we're gonna call this sentences. Now if we've gone ahead and saved that and go back into Unity, if we click on our trigger, we can see that we now have this sentences thing, and we don't have any, so let's add one. And element 1, oh whoops, I clicked on the wrong one, my bad. I just added a new dialog, that's not what I wanted. If I click this sentences and add one, element 0, you can see that we have the text that we can add, and we have a speed for it. So I'm just going to say, this is a test message. We now have text. And I'm going to set the speed to 100. And now let's go back into the code and make it start displaying this text. Now, below this else statement here, we're going to say trigger.start coroutine. And this is another coroutine that we haven't set up yet. This is going to be called display sentence. And in parentheses, we're going to say sentence index. So let's go ahead and set up this coroutine. So down here, I'm going to say IEnumerator display sentence. It's going to take an integer called current sentence. So this coroutine is to actually start displaying the text on the screen. We want to say star.setActive false, so if the star was visible before, we want to make it not visible. We're going to say displaying characters is set to true because we're about to display a bunch of characters. And we're going to say textbox.text, this is the text on the text box, is going to be set to just quotation marks and nothing in it. And then we're going to say yield return new wait for seconds, and this will be about 0.5 f. So basically, once it takes about half a second before the text actually starts appearing on the screen. So there's sort of like a little bit of delay to like kind of make it more realistic, like there's little breaks in between talking. Below this we're going to say char array characters is set to sentences, and then in brackets we're going to say current sentence, and then we're going to say dot text dot to character array. So basically, first of all, a char or a character is just like a single, is like a string, but it's only one character of the sentence. So if we had a sentence that was just the word test and we did this sentence, it would make it into 4 letters, T, E, S, and T. And we're basically saying that this list is set to our sentences list, whatever sentence we're currently on, and then we're accessing the text variable that we set up, and then we're turning it into a character array, because right now it's a string. And so now we want to go through each of these characters and display them one by one onto the text box. So we're going to say for, and we're going to press tab twice, and this will automatically add a for loop for us. And we want to change length to characters dot length. And now it means that this thing is going to run, whatever we put in this for loop is going to run for every character in this character array until it's displayed all of the characters. So first we're going to say textbox.text is plus equal to characters I. So because we're doing for integer I, it starts out at 0, and as it goes through the characters, it increases for each one. So this will go through, and each time it increases, it adds a new character. We're going to say, so we're going to add a new character, and then we're going to say yield return new wait for seconds. And here's where the speed of the text comes in. We're going to say 1 divided by sentences, and then we're going to say current sentence. So the current sentence we're on dot speed. So we're accessing the speed variable in our sentence. So because we do 1 divided by the speed, it means that the higher the speed value is, the faster the text is going to go. And the lower it is, the slower it's going. Now if we save this and go back into Unity, if I go to the character and press the A button next to them, it says this is a test message, we now have text. But there's not really much else we can do now because we haven't set up continuing or adding more sentences. So let's go ahead and add those now. I'm going to add something that we haven't really set up yet, but we're going to need it later. We're going to say if finish sentence early. We're only going to set this to true if it's currently displaying text and we press A again to like skip the displaying text and just finish the sentence immediately. So if that is true, then we're going to say textbox.text is set to sentences current sentence, so the current sentence dot text. So we're just setting it to the full text. And then we're going to say I is set equal to characters dot length. Oh, I just realized I put this in the wrong spot. Let me copy this if statement and put it inside the for loop. That was my mistake. So we set I to the characters dot length so that as soon as it finishes this, it's past the length of characters dot length, so it doesn't run any of this code anymore because it's finished. After this, we're going to say finish sentence early is set to false. So if it was true, it's going to run this, and then it's going to set itself back to false. And then we're going to say yield return null. And then we're going to go outside with the for loop, and we're going to say sentence index plus plus. So it's going to increase the sentence index, which is going to say we're going to go to the next sentence. We're going to say displaying characters is set to false because we're no longer displaying the characters one by one, because at this point it means it's finished the sentence. And then we're going to say star.setActive true. Because we've finished the sentence, we can make the little star in the bottom right appear to signal that we can press A to continue. Next, let's go up to the top, and we have this if sentence index is equal to 0, and we're not currently displaying characters. That's only if we start talking to someone, but we also need to add the other situations you might press A, like if you're skipping through the text, or if you're pressing A to progress to the next sentence. or if you finish and the text needs to close. So outside of this if statement, we're going to say else if sentence index is less than sentences dot length. So if there's still sentences left and we're not displaying characters and we are not closing the sentence. If we're on any sentences other than the first one, we're just going to run whatever code's inside here. So we're going to say trigger dot start coroutine, and we're going to say display sentence, and we're going to say sentence index. So if we think about this, going through this in order, when we first talk to someone, it's going to run all of this code, and it's going to display a sentence starting with sentence index, which is going to start off as 0, so the first sentence, and it's going to display a sentence, and at the end the sentence index increases. So if at that point we press A, now the sentence index has been increased, so we're no longer on the first sentence, so it's not going to do this, and we're not displaying characters anymore, and we're not closing the text box. So it's going to display another sentence, but it's going to do the next sentence, which would be the second sentence. And this can keep going on and on. But there's also the scenario of what if text is currently being displayed one by one, and you press A to skip that to make it the whole text appear. So we're going to say else if displaying characters. So if we're currently displaying characters, we're going to set finish sentence early to true. And remember, down in the display sentence function, for every character we display, we're checking if that finish sentence early variable is true. And if it is, we're going to set the text equal to the full sentence, and then we're going to leave this for loop, and the sentence is completely finished. And lastly, if we want to close the sentence, so we're going to say else if not closing sentence. So because of the way an if, else if works, is it's going to check this condition first, and if that's not true, then it's going to check this condition, and if that's not true, it's going to check this condition, and then this one. Because of the way this text box works, the only way for this to be true, the not closing sentence, is if the last sentence has already been displayed and we want to close the text box. So we're going to say, if that's the case, we're going to say trigger.start coroutine, and we haven't set this up yet. We're going to call a coroutine called close sentence. And now let's go ahead and set up this coroutine. So at the bottom here, below display sentence, we're going to say IEnumerator close sentence. So as soon as we start closing the sentence, we want to set the closing sentence variable equal to true. We're also going to say textbox_anim.play, and we're going to play the text closed, comma 0. So basically, we'll set closing sentence as true, and then it will play the text open animation in reverse, because we set the speed of it to -1, which will make it go from being there to disappearing and going up. Then we're going to say star.setActive false, because if we're closing the text box, that means we also need to make the star in the bottom right corner disappear. Then we're going to say yield return new wait for end of frame. The reason we need to do this is, again, because saying textbox_anim.play to play an animation actually takes a frame before it goes into effect. So this is just waiting for that. And then we're going to say while textbox_anim.getCurrentAnimatorStateInfo 0.isName, or I'm sorry, 0.normalized time is less than 1. So the normalized time is basically the beginning of the animation will return 0 and the end of the animation will return 1. So by saying while it's less than 1, it's basically while the animation hasn't fully finished. So while the text box is still disappearing, we're just going to wait. So we're going to say yield return null. Then we're going to say sentence index is set to 0. And this means that we'll be able to talk to the NPCs again if we talk to them again. It'll reset their dialogue back to the first sentence. And then we'll say if, and this is the part where we can have multiple dialogues for multiple characters in one dialogue part. So if talking to one person results in you actually talking in multiple characters talking, then you can add multiple dialogues for each time a new character speaks. So we can say if trigger.dialogIndex +1. So if the next index value is less than trigger.dialog.length. So basically we're saying if there are still more dialogues after the current one, we're going to say trigger.dialogIndex ++. So we're going to increase the dialog index to go to the next dialogue. Then we're going to say trigger.setThisEvent trigger.type, and we're going to say trigger.thisEvent is trigger.thisEvent.trigger function. So basically, if there's more dialogues, it's going to increase the dialog index, and then it's going to set what the event is in the event trigger, and then it's going to be set to the next dialogue for like the next character, and then it's going to trigger the dialogue again, much like it did up here, but with the next dialogue. But if there's not any dialogues left, so if we've gone through all the dialogues and we want to close and go back to being able to move Mario around, then we're going to say else trigger.dialogIndex is set to 0, so that if we talk to them again, it'll be back to the first dialogue. And then we're going to say trigger.setThisEvent, and this will be trigger.type. So same thing as before, it's just resetting the event in the event trigger. And then we're going to call the end, we're going to call the end function method, which we didn't put anything in. It's one of the override functions. So in this function, all we have to do is make it so that Mario can move again. So we're going to say trigger.machine, so Mario's state machine, .currentState.switchState, and we're going to change back to trigger.machine.states.idle. So basically, when we end this function, we're going to set Mario back to the idle state where he can then go to moving around. So now, in the closed sentence IEnumerator, at the beginning we set closing sentence to true because we're closing the sentence, but we never set it back to false. So at the bottom here, we're going to say closing sentence is set to false. And if we save this, now when I can go talk to the character and it displays the dialogue, and I can do it as many times as I want. And if I press A in the middle, it interrupts it and goes to the end. And let's say I want to add more sentences. So I can go to the sentences and add a second one, and we'll say this is a second sentence. And let's set the speed to be not nearly as fast, so like 30. And let's also add another dialogue. And for that, it'll be, let's add another character, but we'll get rid of the trigger. And the other character can be right here. And if I go back to the trigger, and for the second character, I add the other character. And then I can go to the sentences and change the sentences. Let's just have one, and we'll say, I'm a different character. And set the speed to 100 again. Now, if I go ahead and hit play, we can see that when I talk to this character, it points to the first character first. It says this is a test message, meaning I have text. If I press A, it goes to the next sentence, and it's a bit slower, and it says this is a second sentence, and then it closes, and it goes to the next character's text box, and it says I'm a different character. So now we've done the very, very basics, and I just froze my game because I just jumped into a weird spot. But we now have the very basics of a text system. But there are still a lot of things that I want to add, like giving the text more personality. So, for example, something you can do with text in the UI is you can use something called rich text. And an example of that is if I change this first message to be, if I have these like little in the left sign and then greater than signs, and then I have sizes set to 50% or 150%, you can now see that when I go to talk to the characters after it does the size equals 50% and 150%, the size of the text changes. But the problem is that you could see very briefly that it shows the little size is equal to 50% before it actually changes. So I want to make it so that it doesn't show that. And I also want to add some more things like making there be actual characters with animations and have them face Mario and have Mario face the characters, as well as maybe even giving the text a little more personality. So stay tuned for the next episode. We're going to be expanding upon this text system even more, but this is the very basics. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. See ya.